It was early June of 2016 in southern New York, and three friends, Jamie, Dan, and an unarmed witness, decided to go camping on a mountain. Apparently, they did not know if they were technically allowed to do this, but there are a lot of fire pits in the area, and so they did it anyway. They set up their tent and got their fire going, and just sat there having a few beers and bitching about our women. All of a sudden, the woods became completely silent. You couldn't even hear the crickets. And it apparently felt like there was a lightning storm because static electricity could be felt in the air. The hairs on the back of the unnamed witness's neck stood up. According to Jamie, the air was kind of humming and vibrating. Immediately after this, there was a deep bass noise and a light flashed up in the distance and illuminated the entire nearby forest. It looked like when a real big firework explodes for the first seconds, but it lasted for about a minute before it split up into 3 or 4 other lights and shot back down to the trees. We could see the lights glowing out in the woods, and then there was a big gust of wind and it was gone. Everything smelt like it had just rained, but it never did. The witnesses didn't know what to do, but decided that it was likely just a meteor, and so went back to talking amongst themselves. At about 2 in the morning, they decided to go to sleep. The unnamed witness and Jamie slept in a tent, but Dan decided to sleep by the fire. Roughly an hour later, the witnesses are woken up by Dan shaking them and saying that there was something big watching the camp. The creature was about 50 feet away, give or take, from the fire, according to Dan, and he apparently thought that it might have been a bear. But it was standing on 2 legs and bobbing backwards and forwards as if trying to get a better look at him. While Dan was talking to the witness about this, all 3 of them heard a loud scream that apparently sounded like a pig being slaughtered, but was much deeper and made the witness's ears ring. Apparently, 3 or 4 more creatures came running towards the campsite as the embers from the fire kicked up and landed on the tent. The Dogmen kept running back up to the tent and then promptly running back into the woods. Every once in a while, one of them would scream again and pull on one of the tent poles, dragging the whole tent a foot or 2. By now, the whole tent was collapsing on one side of the witnesses were screaming as loud as they could. Suddenly, everything went quiet again, and the witnesses ran towards their trucks as fast as they could hit the gas. When they were just about to leave, they saw one of the Dogmen illuminated in the road by the truck headlights. At this point, the witnesses attempted to gun it and drive the vehicle straight past the creature, but it then straightened up and puffed up its chest. The witness estimates that the creature was around 8 feet tall and had dark gray all over its body, except for the front where the hair was white or yellow. The face looked like that of a dog, but not really. Apparently, the witnesses knows what Bigfoot looks like, and this was different looking. The Dogmen didn't even move when the witness drove at it, and they had to swerve the truck around it to avoid running over it. They drove back down the mountain and parked the truck in a gas company parking lot, and considered telling the local police, but were discouraged because they didn't know if they were camping somewhere that they shouldn't have been. In the morning time, after the witnesses had sobered up, they drove back to the campsite to find that their property had vanished, including the tent and the cooler. As we packed up all of our stuff, both Eric and I noticed something slowly coming out of the bush about 150 yards north of us. Acting quickly, we dove silently into the fort. We sat there for at least 5 minutes. It was the size of a large wolf, but dark black with long, large white claws. It did not look like anything Eric or I had ever seen before. Nothing we could compare it to. As it vanished from our sights, we cautiously started back. We made it out of the forest where we came to an abandoned house. We did not plan on stopping, but noticed that about 100 yards on the path, the creature was standing on all 4s looking at us. We stood paralyzed as it slowly walked toward us. All of a sudden, it stopped. We got a good look at it. It had dark yellow eyes and not one to look of mercy on its face, and a row of bright white teeth showed. All of a sudden, we heard a noise behind us. We quickly turned around to see a doe and a fawn running out of a thorn bush. We turned around and the creature was gone. Seeing the chance, we ran home. We made it home, but not one memory of that animal will ever leave my mind, and we have not seen it since that day. The scariest story I have is about a night deep in the Oregon woods. I'll preface this by giving my background, not as a brag or anything, just to show that my outdoor and survival bona fides are there. I'm 37. I've literally spent over 5 total years alone in the woods, camping, hiking, you name it. I've went months without ever even talking to another human being. I've taken every class or training you can imagine in identifying animals of all kinds, especially threatening ones that can kill me. I have walked most of the Appalachian Trail barefoot. I have spent weeks in varying wilderness areas across the US and Canada alone. I know what a mountain lion sounds like, whether it's mating, scared, communicating, whatever. I know what foxes, bobcats, owls, and varying birds, moose, elk, deer, varying weasels, bison, bugs, sheep, bear, and everything in between sounds like. When you have a hobby like I do and spend every free second alone in the woods, you have to know sounds. It's absolutely imperative to know if something is close by that wants to eat you. Again, I only say all this because it's inevitable every time I tell one of my stories. At least one person is going to say, "Nah, dude, it's just a fox. They scream like a bloody murder." I've had 3 or 4 sounds that scared me that don't match any animal living in North America. There was only one that made me leave camp early and go back to civilization. This time, I was actually doing a buddy camp with my oldest friend. He is the same age and has more experience in the woods than I do. We met up in Oregon for a 2-week camp in the vicinity of the Mount Hood National Park. We were well off the beaten path, and no people or civilization anywhere near us. One night late, at our camp setup, he and I were sitting by a fire, just bullshitting and reminiscing. It's also important to note we were sober at this time, and I do occasionally drink and I do occasionally smoke cannabis, but never on these trips. Your sobriety and level head can be the difference between life and death out there. As we talked about, from maybe 300 yards or so away, down in a ravine, we heard a howl, growl, scream that persisted for several minutes. It literally vibrated our heads. That's how powerful it was. It was guttural and booming. The only way I've ever been able to describe it is imagine a huge horror movie with a limitless budget. Now imagine some huge, powerful demon. Now, imagine in that movie that demon is somehow defeated and sent back to hell. Imagine the demon's scream of agony and anger as it's dragged back to where it came from. It was terrible. 2 grown men with decades of existence, both of us carrying firearms for protection. Firearms that, if need be, could take down a 1,000-pound bear. And hysteric tears clinging to each other, frantically deciding what to do. We made it until the first signs of day and booked our asses back to our checkpoint and got the hell out of there. And not just the area, but Oregon entirely. A friend reported this incident to me. His wife, mother-in-law, and him were traveling south of Shenandoah Road, going towards Ross Bridge Parkway in Bessemer, Alabama. It's a suburb of Birmingham. As they get into that final stretch of road, he noticed what he thought were 2 taillights of a car ahead of them, about 100 yards. But when they got closer, they realized that these were not taillights. They were actually red eye shine from what looked like a werewolf upright canines standing in the middle of the road. The friend was in the back seat with his wife driving and the mother-in-law in the passenger seat of the Cadillac Escalade SUV. His wife immediately slows down in order to avoid hitting this thing, and that's when he realizes what he is looking at. He said in his own words, "Chuck, this SUV was huge, and it was cut too, like something out of Underworld." Despite the fact that this and the mother-in-law were in the front seats, this thing decides to lock eyes with him as they quickly drove past the creature. All this took place around 8 to 8:30, around at nighttime in summer of 2016. Until this day, he won't take the trash outside unless he has a gun with him. Here's a bit of backstory. I am 15 years old and I live in Kansas City, Missouri, and my girlfriend lives in the rural bit of Kansas. This is important to the story. Me and my family were visiting my girlfriend's family. On our way home, at about 1 a.m., on the side of the road, I saw a dead deer, and as we passed, I saw something. It was huge and covered in fur. I saw it turning back to look at us drive by, and I got the worst feeling I had ever felt. I didn't say anything to my family or friends due to it being so late, and I didn't know if I was imagining it or not. I focused on my music. I had nightmares for weeks after that. I don't know what it was about it that scared the living hell out of me, but that's my story. I still wonder what it was to this day, but I hope I never see what I saw again. I live alone, and in this remote location, we don't have cable, so the only option is satellite TV. Well, satellite anything really. It was a humid summer night in July, and the TV was acting up, so I needed to go out and readjust the satellite, like usual. I took a flashlight and a gun with me. When I went outside, it was unusually quiet. I also purchased an AR due to other sightings I've had, but they weren't credible enough to chalk it up as a Dogman. Like, it was so silent it was unnerving. I brushed the thought off and went to the dish, which is in the corner of my yard. I went to work, making sure that all the wires were all right and pointing it to a different angle. Suddenly, I heard a small snap of a stick to my left and turned the flashlight to the direction I saw a creature standing there. I got a good look at it for what seemed like an eternity, but was only for about 10 seconds. I slowly backed off and ran back to the house and locked all the doors and windows. The creature was unlike anything I've ever seen before. When I shined the light at it, the first thing I saw was the head. It has cropped ears that point upwards. Its snout was narrower than a bear's and longer, and I can make out a large teeth protruding from the jaw. Its eyes were a deep red shade that seemed to reflect off the light I was pointing at it. The body was muscular and huge. It had long arms that appeared to be longer than its legs, broad shoulders that tapered into a skinnier waist. It was slightly crouched over when I saw it, with one hand wrapped around a small tree. I could make out the legs, which looked similar to a dog's legs. It had obvious hocks. Even in the crouched position, it was about my height, which is 6 foot. Standing up to full height, this creature could easily be 7.5 feet tall. The fur was black and thicker on the neck and chest, and the bottom half significantly less so. I didn't know if it was aggressive or not. What I know is I had a feeling of dread unlike anything I've ever experienced. Was it just observing me or stalking me? For a creature this large, it was deceivingly silent. It got within 15 yards of me without me even ever noticing. All I knew was I needed to get out of there and not find out. I don't live on the property anymore, but after the event, I never had another face-to-face encounter. But I would hear sounds in the woods I couldn't explain. They would start off relatively quiet and work their way up to a furious howls and screams, and then back down to quiet again. I don't know if this was the same thing because it could be local wildlife. The location this encounter takes place around roughly Mount Highway 43 Wise River, Montana, in case you want to search up the location on Google. A few years ago, my dad and I were out on a hunting trip together in Minnesota, where we experienced something I'll never forget. Hudson was sleeping in the living room, and all of a sudden, he started barking. I mean barking like he was about to smash through the door and attack what was ever out there. My dad and I went out to the living room to calm him down, but he was standing at the door, hair standing up and barking like mad. My dad repeatedly tried to calm him down, but to no avail. Hudson started pawing at the door, all the while continuing his bark. I looked out the window expecting to see a wolf or a bear wandering around, but I couldn't see anything at all. There's a motion sensor on the front of the cabin to deter the raccoons in the middle of the night, and that wasn't even tripped. Eventually, Hudson calmed down, but he was still restless the rest of the night. I could hear Hudson walking around the cabin. It was almost as if he were standing guard over the whole place. We went out for our first day of hunting, but there wasn't anything worth firing at. We went out on the porch for another cigarette. My dad pointed out that the night was unusually quiet, and I pointed out that so was the day. Something was off. Something was going on in these woods. Hudson started barking again, and even more ferocious than last night. We went back into the cabin and tried to hush him again, but he still wouldn't listen. Again, I peered out of the window, and again I found nothing, except for this time the motion sensor was on. It wasn't on 2 minutes before that we were out there. I began to make movement just outside the light and strained my eyes to see past the light. I finally got my dad to look outside, and his entire demeanor changed. He wasn't so laid back anymore. He was stiffened and agitated. "That's not a bear, son," he said to me. "Then what the hell is it?" I asked. I went over to the gun rack and grabbed my Weatherbury Vanguard rifle. My dad was instantly in front of me. "You shoot at that thing and we're going to have one hell of a problem. Just let it do its thing and wander off like it did last night." I went to the window again and looked outside. The motion sensors were off, but I could just make out movement. It was still there. Hudson quieted down and started pacing around again. I told my dad I think it left, and he looked like he was relieved. He went to the kitchen and grabbed 2 glasses and poured us both a serving of Jack Daniels, his favorite whiskey. He said he caught a glimpse of it, and it looked like a wolf, but it was too big and bulky. I don't know how long I was asleep for, but I woke up to another round of Hudson's incessant barking. He was pawing at my door and barking like mad. I glanced at the window to the right of the bed and damn near fell out of the bed. Whatever Hudson was barking at was peering into the window. It was no wolf. This thing was gigantic. It stared right back at me. It was furry and black and had yellow eyes that looked like they were glowing, ears that were triangular and sitting on top of its head, long canine teeth, and a long wolf-like muzzle. It looked to me like it was hunched over or crouching down so it could look into the window. Then it licked the screen on the window. I leapt out of the bed and bolted out of the room. My dad was already awake, and I started yelling at him that the thing was back outside. I grabbed my rifle again, not caring about my dad's warning, but it was gone. My dad was right behind me and told me not to shoot, that it would just piss it off. He told me he thought it was a werewolf. I saw it with my own eyes. It really did look like a werewolf, like from the underworld movies. He told me that when he saw it, it was standing on 2 legs and it must have been at least 8 feet tall. I moved out of the bedroom into the living room again and looked out of the window. The sensor was tripped again, but I couldn't see the thing anywhere. Eventually, Hudson did calm down again and was quiet. I continued to stare out the window, watching for any signs of the creature's return. For the rest of the night, though, neither of us slept. We just waited. Every time Hudson got up, though, my body twitched, waiting for him to start barking again, but he never did. The sun rose, and we walked around the cabin, but found nothing. We trekked out into the woods, but didn't get too far into them. There were no signs that a werewolf monster had been there the night before. I thought to myself, maybe Hudson could pick up the trail, and when I said it aloud to my dad, I heard how foolish I sounded. It dawned on me that I didn't actually want to find proof that this thing was out there, and I definitely didn't want to find the thing itself. My dad said we should probably just go back to the cabin and pack up. I didn't have a problem with that at all. I used to work about 30 miles away from where I live. One night, I had been stuck in heavy traffic coming home. I take Lasix, so after a while, I really had to go to the bathroom. I kept telling myself that I was almost home and tried to hold it until I got there. By the time I got to my exit, I knew I wasn't going to be able to make it to my house. So I pulled up to an area where Fidelity Investments is located and found an area that was isolated. This area is heavily wooded with walking trails and a lot of game, but it is also in a very populated area. I pulled up a little side drive off of one of the main roads. That little drive is about 100 feet long with only room for one car. It went up an elevation and had bushes on the right side, facing the main road. On the left side, there was a guardrail and a view of the valley below. The area up there is huge and isolated with several buildings that are all spaced out. The place is dark at night because there are intermittent streetlights up there. At night, it's pretty deserted too. A few cars go through that area though, because it's a shortcut people use to go from Taylor Mill over to 3L Highway, where there are stores, restaurants, etc. When you're up there, you're above everything around this area. When I stopped, I got out of my car, waited a moment and looked around to make sure there were no other cars. It was winter at the time, so the bushes between where I was and the road below me didn't have many leaves on them. Because of that, you could see right through them. I was up on this little rise, about 20 or 30 feet above the drive, which was 4 lanes wide to be exact. To the left of me was a streetlight and more woods that went down another hill, to the main road to be exact. I went to the back of my car and did what I had to do. When I finished, I stood up and all at once, every hair on my body stood up. I knew I wasn't alone. I quickly scanned the area in front of me and must have heard something behind me because I turned around and there were 3 deer standing there, all huddled up together, between my car and the guardrail. They weren't looking at me though. They were looking over across the road. I looked back over there and that was when I saw a figure standing between the bushes in front of it and the tree line behind it. It was huge. I stand 5'5". Some of those bushes were about 6 feet tall, but they only came up to about the collarbone area on this thing. Due to the street light to the right of it, about 20 feet away, I was able to get a pretty clean outline of this thing. It had a large dog-shaped head and pointed ears. I couldn't make out its neck, but I can make out massive shoulders. That's when it growled. It was a deep vibration I could feel in my chest and all over my body. In fact, my entire body just took over at that point. Now, I have to explain this part of it to you. I worked security for years in California in the music business. As a woman, I really have to defend myself and train properly. I kicked box for roughly 8 years and worked out every single day. Now, I also train dogs, mainly Anatolian Shepherds and German Shepherds. Sometimes I have to establish who is the alpha, and to do that, I get them down, hold them in place, and grab them by their ear and growl until they submit. Then the training can start. So when this thing growled at me, it was just pure instinct. I dropped down to a crouching position and growled right back at it. When I did that, it stopped growling and started sniffing the air immediately. Its snout went up and it turned its head slightly as it was sniffing. It then took a few steps forward. I was still crouched down on all fours and moved forward, still growling at the thing. When I did that, it stopped. I stood up and kept staring right at it, and I never broke eye contact with it. Then, it slowly stepped back into the tree line until I couldn't make it out as clearly as before and started to move to the right of me. The deer were still behind me. They were so close I could have reached out and touched them with my hands. I waved my arms around and told them to get out of there. When I did that, they went back over the guardrail and took off down the hill. That's when I jumped in my car and got out of there as fast as I could. I felt this thing was trying to circle behind me, and I wasn't going to wait around for that. Do I think I scared it? No. But I do think I confused it for a couple of minutes, and that gave me time to move. I told my husband about what had happened up there, but I didn't tell him exactly what I saw. He would think I was nuts, and to be honest, I thought I was going a little crazy myself until I saw a picture of a Dogman. I know there are other things in this world that can't be explained. I've seen them, but this was beyond any of those things. Since this has happened, I can't take that shortcut through that area anymore. My husband took me back over that way once to see the area, and I was begging him to get me out of there the whole time. I thought I was going to be sick. The wildlife up there has almost totally disappeared. I never see anything up on the hills anymore. The street I live on is only about 1 mile or so down the hill from this place, and lately, we have seen coyotes on the streets, like they have been chased out, and pets here have started to go missing. We've also seen a large black figure moving through our backyards down here. The dogs throughout the neighborhood go crazy regularly. People were calling the cops when we saw the large black figure jumping fences. I'm concerned that it has come down the hill after eating up everything else up there.